I'll come to my last question, and then maybe we should give the floor to the audience, not only applauding but also asking questions. Anyway, on the first glance, it can seem you're negative, as you said in your autocritical way, but in the preface to the Croatian edition of this book, and this is not PR, I'm mentioning it because I think it's an important part of the preface, and I'm really glad you have written it. You mention Egypt, of course, and you say Egypt gives you some sort of hope that the memory of socialism could be revitalized. And you mentioned something which I would like you to explain. It's a term called democratic socialism. So could you please tell us what do you mean by this?
Democratic socialism, I mean, this is also something that a phrase that I learned from Gramsci. See, when Gramsci was writing about how to think about making, about instrumentalizing the intellectual so that the prejudices of the proletariat against the subaltern could be undone, he was saying that it's not just a question of making the unskilled skilled, but making this person into a quote citizen unquote, which quote unquote, who by definition could be a dirigent, could be a director. So that was his, when he talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, because he's after all of his time, and he did see success. He was chairman of the Communist Party, and he was put in jail because he was feared. So to an extent, that phrase meant something to him. But at any rate, when he talks about that, he talks about it in terms of a democratic system to come. So that I think by that is, in my own country, which I don't knock completely, but it is true that to have 17 left parties within a system where the center is not socialist has been a chastening experience, and so as I said to you before, the ones who have brought the left down in my state after 34 years, they really did it without thinking about the fact that there is some kind of internationality to the left struggle, a history that can be redone in terms of, as I said, we are not Marxist fundamentalists. In fact, when asked in Frankfurt, my colleague answered, you cannot be a Marxist without reading Marx, and I answered, you can. So that I would stand behind it. So therefore, it seems to me that this idea of admiring, of going back to socialism, it was said as an Indian, we were incredibly with Jamal Nasser, right? So to an extent, but we know that he was not, he fell into the same kind of problem that all socialist experiments after success has fallen into, except within the Second International Democratic Structure. So this is where my confused feelings about a democratic socialism comes. I'm a pacifist, an internationalist, a democratic socialist, because it seems to me that within that structure there is a possibility of this epistemological transformation. Democracy to me is a double bind. The same double bind that made Plato dismiss it, he didn't like it, and that made Aristotle already talk about the double bind between, he didn't have the word double bind, but the aporia between ipseity and the other, between mathematics, the numbers, and merit, and so on and so forth. Of course it's a double bind. It's an instrumental thing, poison, and the rational generalizations of democracy are as dangerous as they're powerful. And those freedoms always have to be bound to particular issues. I'm not romanticizing some word called democracy, but it does seem to me as a the left critic of the parliamentary left, the frontier group with which I've been all my life associated. I would say that there is something in that site of struggle which is, I hope, useful. But remember, I'm really not someone who generalizes well. I can dream, I can be as careful as I can be, but ultimately I think if I have any value, it's in giving my time and skill, teaching folks how to read things like Tahrir Square, how to read things as they read verbal texts. That's my only, and I may be wrong, like I said, judge me. This is why, counterintuitive people like me do not, in fact, like very much to be applauded, because we are generally being applauded for the wrong thing. I would rather not be understood too quickly, because it takes time. It really, I myself have not understood things quickly. It takes time. Let things kind of settle and sediment. And perhaps, say, hey, when I went to South Africa, right after the first I went before apartheid was lifted, at the invitation of the ANC, they were not interested in the Aboriginals, they were interested in Gandhi. And then I went, I gave the first lecture on academic freedom after the lifting of apartheid. The students were not particularly keen on me because I was saying things like this, which is understood as negative. But what to do, that is also speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power is not just speaking to dictators and saying buzz off. So they didn't like it. Then in 1992, Joan Vincent says, puts that in a collection, and says, was Gayatri Spivak prescient that not in 1992, 2003, that in 1992 she was already saying this? I said, no, I wasn't prescient. I just wasn't kind of jumping with euphoria, because these things, it's too soon to tell. So it seems to me that that's where I think, and I may be completely wrong, you test me out, but not right here, that democratic socialism has a certain, and believe me, within it there is that supplementing vanguardism which applies as much to the dubious thing called democracy as it applies to the terrifying thing called socialism. So therefore, there is that supplementing vanguardism and its connection to the ignoring of gender as the first tacit reproductive heteronormativity as the first tacit globalizer that comes into work at every step of this global utopia today. All of this together make for a very unstable combination. And yet it seems to me that in that instability is the future. Because the future is not in our hands. The future is undecidable. The future is anterior, it's unexpected. Something will have happened because we plan, not because our plans succeed. Are we going to be practical and remember that? Or are we going to be euphoric and withdraw an analysis? That's the thing that leads me to uttering the phrase democratic socialism. But I'm not a leader.
Thanks a lot. I will not ask an applause, maybe in the end, but now I think we can turn finally to the questions of the audience. While you are thinking, maybe I can just pose another question, if there is no hand in the meantime. No hand. You are, of course, critical of the concept of multitude and such new political subjects, but my question is, where do you see the opportunity for a new political subject? I'm not speaking about the subaltern now, but in the perspective of the events in Maghreb and the Arab world. And of course, on the other hand, there is the World Social Forum, Genova, Seattle, and all these movements. Do you see any hope in this movement?
What is meant by a new political subject? I know that you have no question for me, but may I ask this question? I mean, I'm really asking everybody, not just you, Srečko, what is meant by a new political subject? And what is meant by? Are there people here who like the idea of the multitude? I mean, I'm not obliged to give an answer to questions anymore. I can expect something from you folks sitting here. So can I ask you this question? Are there people here who feel energized by the idea of the multitude? And what is meant by the new political subject? Does anyone want to speak to me about that? Or do you want to withhold an answer? It's all right if you want to withhold an answer. I will go away with that memory. But not a problem, not a problem. But you say, I would be a fool to think about it. I'm not able to say to me, I'll go away with that one. It's a field work, isn't it? You couldn't make it in Croatia. So, let's see. I think we should let it go.
Maybe if they don't have an answer, maybe they have a question. Or
Don't push it. If they don't want to ask a question, they don't want to ask a question.
but can he ask a question?
Okay.
Just a second, we have a mic somewhere, so we'll hear you better.
I can do it. Okay.
Wonderful.
So I don't know if this is the good question or are you maybe the right person to answer it, but I'll try anyway. Can you maybe say what you think and explain to us a little about the Naxalite rebellion in India? Because me personally, I don't know much about it, and maybe you do a little more.
That's a very fine question indeed, the Naxalites. The Naxalites were basically, I mean, I can talk about the Bengali Naxalites. In some ways, Telangana, which happened before, is thought of. I mean, you can obviously read books. There are paperback books available, good books. Shumanta Banerjee, Lawrence Lipschitz. These are excellent books on the Naxalite movement. But the Naxalites, basically, it was an intellectual movement, and you see the West Bengal is intellectual left, right? So that it's almost falling off a log to be on the left. That's how it was, and it was an intellectual movement which inspired the peasants, who then joined with the group. Again, it is sometimes presented as the peasants inspiring the intellectuals, but that is powerful, of course. That's, I sometimes think of it as the 1968, where the students and workers joined in Paris, etc. But what happened was that it was because of the incredible abuse of so-called land reform. That's how it began. But the focus of the Naxalite movement, because they were connected to the countryside, they also thought of themselves as Maoists for that reason, because they were rural, not because they were particularly following giving the Chairman Mao's little red book. But they had Chairman Mao's, because my generation is just after my generation, and many people claim to be Naxalites who really were not. But the fact remains that they were extremely ruthlessly suppressed in the cities, whereas in the countryside, once the very broad leadership sector was suppressed, this kind of brutality. I mean, I could give you examples of actual people I know who were in the police, people who went to school with me, the brutality with which they shot down the so-called hundreds of young men and women, mostly men, but women too, who were the intellectual leaders who were trying to work with the peasant forces. So, in fact, the situation of land reform very quickly disappeared from the agenda when this group was killed off like this. Now, the Naxalites in many ways regenerate themselves when certain kinds of armed struggle, let's call it, emerge in the countryside. But that really is more of a taking on of a name with the past, rather than a continuation of the initial, not that it matters, rather than a continuation of the initial Naxalite movement. The Naxalite movement takes its name, as you may know, from a place called Naxalbari, where this kind of oppression of the peasants had broken out in such a way that the intellectuals stepped forth to, the left intellectuals stepped forth to support them. Now, the Naxalites who survived, most of them, and again, they're still under police supervision after all these years, but most of them have moved into decentralized ecological agriculture, because the peasant sector, after all, it's very, very hard to do that, because our government, central government, the government of India, is of course completely given over to Monsanto, Cargill, the Brazilian company that does chemical stuff. The Chinese man is doing fantastic work on the group that actually does this kind of work, the group that does the chemical fertilizers, genetic engineering. It's much bigger than just Monsanto and Cargill. And of course the central government, since 1991 in India, is with them. And so, in fact, that's a much harder struggle for the peasant sector in West Bengal than anything else. And so, most of the Naxalite survivors that I happen to know about, I mean, again, I know of this because I know of this. I'm not a Naxalite, so, I mean, I'm not a Naxalite, but I mean, I certainly, again, admire them greatly, and many of the dead were friends. But that's what they do, but they're still under police supervision. That's a very general, personal account. I'm glad you asked a question. And, but I would, again, recommend these two paperback books that are somewhat old as better sources than much that is now written and spoken about Naxalism and Maoism. One is Larry Lipschitz's book, and the other is Sumanta Banerjee's book. These two are worth reading.
Thank you. So I won't push it anymore, but there is a question. There are two questions if you are ready just to take.
I can take any number of questions. I just don't, I mean, if you want to ask, I'm instructed. I'm very grateful. So please ask questions.
So maybe the first, here was a question, and then I've seen a hand there behind. So.
Could you tell us?
Can you hear me? Yes.
I think I can speak enough loud. Tell us, maybe.
You will have to scream.
Scream. Okay, I'll
This is a
try.
big
No,
room.
there is a mic. Can someone please bring the mic?
This is a big room.
The differences between the communist parties in West Bengal and Kerala, aren't they mostly those which...
Where are you?
Can you please stand up and speak a bit louder, please?
Yeah, I understood the question. The difference between the
If
communist
you can
parties
stand up.
West Bengal and Kerala. Let me see you. Let me speak to
Can you please
Is
stand
it
up?
okay?
a person. Yes.
Okay, I can stand up.
Where are you?
I'm here.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, now it's yes.
What I'm interested in are the differences between communist parties in West Bengal and Kerala. Are they those which come up out of regional differences between Kerala with its special history, specific ones, and West Bengal, or there are some basic attitudes in the Marxist doctrine as well?
Thank you for the question. She's asking about the basic difference between the CPM and the CPI. CPM, Communist Party Marxist, which is, or as we say in Bengal, CPM. We don't really talk about it in a very English way. The CPM, which is West Bengal, we lost, and the CPI, which was more, today the difference is kind of nominal, okay? It's because the left is so disenfranchised in India that it's the alliance that is more important than the differences. But in the old days, CPI used to be, the Communist Party of India, in other words, rather than the Communist Party Marxist, used to be more Moscow-based, more supportive of Moscow, CPI, Kerala. And West Bengal was more, was not, in fact, its face was not towards Moscow, as it were. It was more local. But both of them are also Indian parties. It's not, they are both also, of course, in all of the states, including at the center. It's not like it's just that West Bengal and Kerala were controlled by the party in power was CPM. It isn't anymore in West Bengal. For 34 years it was, and in Kerala it still is. But if you go generationally, you will find what you said, and I expect you know something about this, and I hope you agree with me. If you go generationally, then there is much more commonality. Kerala is also very remarkable in having a very strong Dalit movement, which is not particularly aligned with the Communist Party. I don't know if you know what the Dalit movement is, okay? The Dalit, or Dalit, as whatever it is called, the Dalit is a Sanskrit, which is classical, one of the classical Indian languages. It's a word which means trampled upon, okay, Dalit. So, by Dalit is meant all of the people whom one would call subaltern, unfortunately. The people who had been what the 1947-49 Nehru Mountbatten Constitution declared to be scheduled castes and scheduled tribes who were on a schedule so that they would get special constitutional advantages. It didn't work. It doesn't work. But it's good that it's there. Now, these folks have joined together to form a movement which is not particularly aligned to the left parties, because the left leaders are quite often, in fact, upper caste Hindus. So there are some Muslims, but mostly the leadership has gone in that direction. So the Dalits in Kerala, the Dalit movement in Kerala, because Kerala is a Christian majority state, and and they are very fully literate. Among the Christians, there is a division. There are the so-called Syrian Christians who are supposed to have been established by St. Thomas, one of Christ's apostles. And there are the converted Christians who were converted by the European missionaries, who were supposedly the Dalit Christians, because they were so oppressed by the Hindus that they found refuge in Christianization. Now, between the Syrian Christians and the Dalit Christians, this deep division is also part of the Dalit movement. So therefore, I think the real difference between Kerala and West Bengal is the fact that the Dalit leader happens, John Dewey's student, Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, who was a very solid critic of Gandhi and who in fact came forth to redo the constitution and became a Buddhist because for him Buddhism stood for a kind of secularism that was not Hinduism. So that his presence is very strongly felt in Kerala, and so that gives the question of the left a different kind of focus. In other words, there is a very strong critical movement in Kerala, which is not just red baiting, which is something else, which really moves toward the settler colony that I was mentioning right in the beginning. I would say that in brief, that is the difference between the two left parties. They're not just West Bengal and Kerala, they're also Indian, they're in every state, and West Bengal can no longer be described as comparable to Kerala because it is, the Communist Party Marxist is not in power there. And the Naxalite party is of course called Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. That's the difference, these are names. So I'm interested that you want me to speak about India. This is good. But of course, in India, I work focused in that way, and I've lived for 50 years in the United States. So I'm not the best informant on India. Every time I go to India, I have very little to do with intellectuals and universities. I deposit my luggage in Calcutta and buzz off into the interior, do my work, go back because I have that job as well. But these are real questions. I hope I've been able to give answers that are more or less satisfactory. But if there are people who study India here, you probably know better than I do. Is there another question?
Yeah, so we have time for a question here and the last question there because it's already a bit late. So please.
Yeah, my question is actually in 3 parts. So the first part is, what about Bhopal? Would you say that the whole relationship towards the people of Bhopal kind of shows a cynicism on the part of Western powers, well, basically Union Carbide and everything? Connected to that, would you say that through showing the trauma of Bhopal in the Sinas and most people, he also criticizes the neocolonialism? And also, would you say that in the novels, Indian English novels from the 1980s to now, there is a kind of criticism of neocolonialism through the trauma that they show in individuals, in the environment, and so on, in the whole society? Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, well, but as I say, I'm not an Indianist, I'm only an Indian. So I will try my best to give my answers. Bhopal, yes, of course, what I think the Bhopal decision shows great cynicism. It's absolutely shocking, but it's not surprising that Union Carbide basically got off. I think what Bhopal needs really is an overturning of this there. I think both, making investigative journalism absolutely public would be of great good, because these people, generations are coming up. So that when I said that investigative journalism, just talking about the fact that this is awful is not going to turn anybody into anything. But in order to make a global multinationals change policy, that's a different way of dealing with it. I'm not in that trade, but it seems to me that that could be something. When I march, I join public interest litigations, I do what I can. But it's this fact of the people of Bhopal really needing more than the compensation, pitiful compensation that they've gotten, and that generations are actually suffering. This is a fact that relates to the human body. This is a fact that we didn't talk. I had thought that you would ask, but you haven't read the preface to the translation yet. You probably haven't yet had the chance to look at the translation. I had thought that somebody for sure was going to ask me a question about the ethical, because I talk about it there, and I quickly printed out the first 2 pages of the ethical, of ethics and politics, and etc., etc. But I'm glad you didn't ask me that question. But that would have been not really an Indian question. But the problem is that in the ethical, quite often, we say that the ethical, mysterious as it is, begins in the human as object, not as subject. And the human as object is tied by the fact that we are all alive and dying as we are born. This thing is what has been interfered with in Bhopal. It's the human body. And so therefore, it's not just enough to go on saying that, oh yes, I mean, what does one expect Union Carbide to be? Jesus Christ? No. They have behaved like Union Carbide. And so they were not frightened enough by anyone. And the Supreme Court of India was in collusion with it. I mean, Supreme Court of India also brought in a very peculiar decision in terms of the destruction of the masjid in 1992. So this is, I'm with you, of course. Bhopal remains a wound. Now, as for criticism of neo-colonialism, what I was trying to say was those kinds of arguments don't work anymore. I was God knows Robert Reich, whom I've quoted many, many times, who was Bill Clinton, who's loved in Kosovo, by the way, Bill Clinton's labor secretary, who is certainly not like communist or anything, but he was, so many years ago, already wrote very cogently about supercapitalism in the global context, and talked about the secessionist managerial class, which is global and not neo-colonial. The idea of neo-colonial I quite understand what is meant by it, but it's the structure of social injustice today has moved into another conjuncture. It's not. Globalization is not another name for neo-colonialism, number one. And Indian novels written in English, I have to say that, again, that's a very specific genre. And I explained what I teach. I'm a French, English, German comparative literature person, and I do not really, I teach. And in general, I'm more in cultural politics and the political philosophy and stuff like that, theory, capital T, like that. I don't really believe that literature I don't think the connection between aesthetics and politics is a direct connection. And I think if one thinks that there is a certain problem, it's a kind of alibi, because one can write anything one wishes in the literary. And also, if one looks at, I'm now talking about literature, okay? I'm not talking about neo-colonialism or its critique. I don't think the personal trauma of literary protagonists is in general a critique of any kind of anything. I don't think literature is a shortcut to political information. I also think that, and I'm going to say something very, very negative here, but it is a fact of the matter. I mean, anybody who goes to any Commonwealth Association international meeting will hear actual writers complaining about this from all of the former British Commonwealth, countries where English writing is also produced, as in India. These writers in English get such incredible advances from publishers compared to the kind of money that it's leading to the death of the languages in the 23 of the literatures in the 23 regional languages of India. And they are called parochial because people can't read them. On the other hand, the fact that these literatures written in novels written in English seem to have, as you yourself indicated, a kind of common thread of personal trauma narratives, that is not supposed to be parochial. And so there is a great deal of resentment, even ressentiment, among the practitioners of literature in the regional languages, which are dying because of the marketplace policy toward the writers in English that seems to remain completely hidden because the content seems to lead to a shortcut to political correctness. I also say, not just about Indian literature written in English, but any kind of literature, that it's not an excuse for avoiding homework in the academy. It's not a shortcut to learning about cultures or political practice or anything. Literature is, I could talk at great length about the usefulness of literature, but I'm afraid that in that particular area, of course it's not my specialty, I do read some good work. I just read a very fine young writer from Assam called Janhavi Barua, who has not made it into the big market. I just happened to read her in Delhi. She seemed to me to be a very fine writer indeed, but I don't think that reading her, one would particularly think that one was getting a critique of neocolonialism. One would certainly, it is based in certain kinds of traumas common to that part of India, and it's very moving. Some of the stories are better than others. I don't think she's going to hit the marketplace because she will be, although writing in English, she will be considered too parochial because she's not writing about her trauma. But that's what I would say. I cannot speak. It's not my specialty. I don't teach it. But I cannot speak of it with the kind of confidence that people who only read English can pull up. There was one more question. Do we have time?
Yes.
At the back.
Yes, we see you.
Just first of all, I want to say how absolutely delighted I am that you're in Zagreb, that your texts have been translated into Croatian. They're difficult enough in English for English speakers, and for Croatian students, almost impossible to read in English. So I think that's a fantastic contribution to our knowledge and our experience here. I'd also like to say I haven't got an Indian question. I've actually never even thought of you as an Indian, which might be a mistake. I always thought of you as an academic from the US. And I've always really admired your kind of critique of a certain benevolence in Western academia when trying to confront what is seen as repressive representations or forms of other kind of subjugations. And my question really is to do with the field of post-colonial studies and whether this is an area that you feel comfortable in being situated in terms of, in the UK, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but often yourself, Homi Bhabha and Said will be spoken about as the holy trinity of post-colonial studies.
First of all, thank you for your kind words. I was beginning to feel that perhaps I had just been too abrasive for everybody, but one needs a little bit of kindness, and I'm glad you're the last question. Yes, of course I know that Edward, Homi and I are considered, I mean, there's much published prose where the three of us are invoked as starting post-colonial studies. Well, you know, I will say what I said to the Japanese development people, and I think it's very, very significant that this group, this particular group had its 20th anniversary just before the trouble struck in Japan. It was the Japanese Association for Socially Interested Development, JASID, and they, International Development, sorry. They had their 20th anniversary and they were kind enough to invite me to be their keynotist. I was very humbled because after all, these are all development sociologists. And why did they think I had anything to say to them? I was very careful. I spoke as honestly as I could. And they had asked, they had this whole business about post-colonial in their blurb, in their invitation. And I said what I said here, that, post-colonial is too strongly tied to the national liberation, to nation states, and so in fact today it doesn't have much of a purchase as a point of global critique. But then I said that if on the other hand one thought of post-colonial just as a general rubric for any kind of struggle against forces, that, who cares if the definition is correct or not? Academically, one has to be somewhat careful in the classroom. But on the other hand, describing the kinds of resistances that happen, if one could take the adjective post-colonial outside of only national liberation struggles and outside of the metropolitan upper-class migrant like homie Edward and myself in three very different situations. If one took it away from us, certainly it could be used. Why should one say, use only the correct word? You know what I mean? So then I went on to talk about alternative developments of various sort. So I'm not a censor, okay? But from what I understand, one thing I would say, which I've said many times, both in Algeria and in India, those of us who began to see decolonization failing right after independence, and in this I'm with Frederick Douglass, the idea that when you feel the solution has come, that's when the problem begins. For us, post-colonial was an ironic term. But then, I wrote in the United States in the 80s for personal reasons, because I didn't feel comfortable being an expert. How wrong I was. But didn't feel comfortable being an expert on French feminism and deconstruction. I felt that I wanted to kind of be more identitarian. I wrote a couple of things, 3 women's texts in Critique of Imperialism, which is very black and white, finger pointing. It's the most anthologized piece of mine because it's easy post-colonialism. They're wrong, they're bad. And I wrote also French Feminism in an International Frame. I wrote Can the Subaltern Speak? And with these, and I translated Draupadi with my introduction. With these, which was very romantic about the Naxalite movement, with these, I suddenly found out that I was being post-colonial. Once I found that, I became a critic of post-colonial reason, because I felt in it the kind of alibi for the upwardly class mobile, and I was deeply disturbed by South Asian post-colonialism because it ignored the settler colony aspect, and we were the most vocal. So, to an extent, even as I support a certain kind of appropriation of the word for certain kinds of struggles, predictably, I'm very critical of the self-congratulatory aspect of post-colonialism. Every self-declared rupture is also repetition. And At the same time, I myself feel that although I have been labeled forever as a post-colonial critic, I'm very uneasy with that particular adjective. In India, post-colonial has become somewhat fashionable again because of the folks who have gone over to the United States, especially people like Chakravorty. But among historians in place like Romila Thapa, Srimati Sarkar, etc., post-colonial is a historical descriptive rather than a description of something going on today. I think that's about where I stand with the... And one thing I will say, when the subalterns speak was really not against the British, it was against the Hindus. So basically that was the target. So if that was post-colonial, it was only partly so. But it was forever called post-colonial. That's as it may be. But really, thank you very much for your kindness.
Hvala svejedno na aplauzu. Ovo je službeno kraj Subversion film festivala, ili je? Mislim da je, konačno. Hvala vam svima što ste dolazili. Pozivam vas također da kupite i knjigu, mislim da je na popustu da košta samo 100 kuna. Sad ne znam kakav odnos Gayatri ima s potpisivanja, međutim vjerujem da će vam potpisati i knjigu. I pozivam vas da iduće godine također dođete na festival. Hvala svima još jednom.